It was a bright morning, the kind of day that filled the streets with a soft golden light and promised good fortune. Old Bruno, with his weathered skin and hair as white as snow, approached the jewelry store with an eager heart. He had spent months saving every cent he could spare to buy a special gift, a fine timepiece for his beloved son Theodore, whose birthday was just around the corner. It was not just a watch. It was a symbol of all the years of sacrifice and love he had poured into raising his boy. Bruno hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door, which chimed softly as he entered. The jewelry shop was filled with glittering treasures, all neatly arranged behind glass counters. The shop owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harding, was standing behind the counter, chuckling as he whispered something to a young woman. She was beautiful, dressed in a striking red dress that hugged her form, her eyes gleaming with mischief. She gave Mr. Harding a smile that could melt the iciest of hearts before she slipped out of the shop without a word, her perfume lingering in the air. Bruno approached the counter, feeling a little nervous as he smiled at Mr. Harding. But before he could even get a word out, the store owner turned away, his smile vanishing abruptly. Mr. Harding suddenly looked agitated. His eyes were darting from one glass case to another until he shouted in shock, "It's gone. My diamond is gone." His face turned pale, and then his eyes landed squarely on Bruno, narrowing with suspicion. You stole it!" Harding screamed, his face twisted with anger. Bruno was stunned, his heart pounding. He hadn't even touched anything. He opened his mouth to deny the accusation, but before he could, Mr. Harding had already picked up the phone and called the police. It wasn't long before Officer Alvin arrived. Tall, muscular, with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to carry a permanent scowl, Alvin's presence commanded fear. He took one look at Bruno, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Another black thief," he muttered under his breath as he approached. Without a single question, Alvin grabbed Bruno by the collar and struck him across the face. Bruno fell to the floor, his cheek burning from the blow. "Please!" Bruno pleaded, struggling to his knees. But Alvin was deaf to his cries. He hauled Bruno up roughly, cuffing his hands behind his back. Tears streamed down Bruno's face as he shouted for help, for mercy, for someone to listen. But there was no one. Alvin dragged him out of the store and shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The ride to the station was a blur of confusion and fear for Bruno. He kept thinking about Theodore, about how his boy would come home, and wonder where his father had gone. At the police station, Alvin shoved Bruno into a damp, dark cell that reeked of mildew. Bruno tried to speak, but Alvin cut him off with a shove that sent him sprawling. "You'll confess," Alvin growled, "or you'll never see the light of day again." Days passed in that dreadful cell. Alvin interrogated him mercilessly, demanding a confession. Each time Bruno denied the crime, Alvin's rage grew. He would slam his fists on the table, strike Bruno across the face, or kick him until he was lying in pain on the cold, hard floor. Alvin's hatred for black people fed his cruelty, but it wasn't just that. He was under immense pressure from his boss, who had made it clear that unless the diamond was recovered soon, Alvin's career was in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Theodore had just returned home after a long business trip. He was excited to celebrate his birthday with his father, but when he entered their small home, he found it empty. Confused, he asked the neighbor, Mrs. Green, if she had seen his father. "I saw the police take him," she said, her eyes full of worry. "They said he stole something from the jewelry store." "I'm so sorry." Theodore felt his heart drop. He wasted no time. He went straight to the police station, demanding to see his father. But Alvin blocked his path, his eyes filled with disdain. "Get out of here," Alvin spat. "Your old man's a thief, and there's nothing you can do about it." Theodore clenched his fists, trying to keep his temper in check. But when Alvin smirked at him, calling his father a worthless criminal, Theodore, a heavyweight boxer who had spent years in the ring, lost his composure. He swung at Alvin, his fist connecting with a force that sent the officer stumbling back, blood spraying from his mouth. "You'll pay for this," Alvin screamed, his face contorted in fury. "I'll throw you in jail." Right next to him, realizing his mistake, Theodore turned and ran out of the station. But Alvin's rage only grew. He returned to Bruno's cell, his eyes blazing with hatred. He kicked Bruno, stomping on his hand as the old man cried out in agony. "Your son attacked me," Alvin snarled. "Confess now, or I'll make sure he suffers for it." Bruno lay on the floor, panting from the pain, tears streaming down his face. He thought of Theodore, his sweet boy, who had always looked up to him. He couldn't let his son suffer because of him. With a heavy heart, Bruno looked up at Alvin, his voice barely a whisper. "I did it," Bruno said. "I stole the diamond. Just leave my son alone." Alvin grinned, satisfied. He reported the confession to his superiors, confident that his troubles were over and that his promotion was secure. The day of the trial arrived, and Bruno stood before the judge, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He was ready to take the blame, to sacrifice himself for Theodore. The judge looked at him, his gavel ready. "Do you plead guilty?" the judge asked. Before Bruno could respond, the courtroom doors burst open. Theodore rushed in, followed by a woman that caused the entire courtroom to gasp. Jessica, Officer Alvin's wife. Alvin's face went pale at the sight of her. "What are you doing here?" Alvin demanded, but Jessica avoided his gaze, her face full of shame. Theodore stepped forward, addressing the judge clearly. "Your Honor, I brought the real thief." He presented evidence, surveillance footage from the jewelry store, and testimonies from employees who had seen Jessica acting suspiciously. The footage showed Jessica slipping the diamond into her purse while she had distracted Mr. Harding. The judge examined the evidence, his expression hardening. He looked at Jessica, who stood trembling. "Mrs. Jessica, you are hereby charged with theft and will be taken into custody." The officers moved in, cuffing Jessica as she burst into tears. Alvin watched in shock, unable to move or speak. His entire world was collapsing around him. The judge then turned his attention to Alvin, his eyes filled with disdain. "Officer Alvin," the judge said, "due to your cruel and unjust treatment of Mr. Bruno, you are stripped of your position effective immediately. You will be reassigned as a janitor at this very station, a fitting punishment for your actions." Alvin's face turned red with shame. He lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His career was over, his pride shattered. He had lost everything. Bruno, on the other hand, was free. The judge dismissed the charges, and Bruno walked out of the courtroom, his heart swelling with relief as he saw Theodore waiting for him. Father and son embraced tightly, tears flowing freely as they held onto each other. They had faced the worst, but they had come out on the other side together. Justice had finally been served, and as they walked out of the courthouse, Bruno knew that no matter what happened, he and Theodore would always have each other. They returned home, ready to leave the nightmare behind and live in peace once more. Life slowly returned to normal for Bruno and Theodore. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of healing and reflection. Theodore helped his father regain his strength, making sure Bruno ate well and rested. He even insisted on taking time off from work to be with his father, to make up for the lost days and share moments they had almost missed forever. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Bruno turned to Theodore, his eyes glistening. "You saved me, son. I can't ever repay you for what you did." Theodore shook his head, smiling softly. "You raised me, Papa. You made me who I am. I would have done anything to bring you back." He paused, looking out at the horizon. "We have each other, and that's all that matters now." Bruno nodded, a deep sense of contentment settling over him. He knew Theodore was right. For so long, he had feared the world would take his son from him. But now, sitting there beside him, he knew nothing could ever break the bond they shared. As weeks turned into months, Bruno began to find purpose again. He decided to volunteer at a local community center, helping children who were struggling, just like he had once struggled. His story of perseverance and strength began to inspire others. People who heard about his ordeal saw him not just as a victim, but as a beacon of hope. Theodore returned to the boxing ring, but he fought with a new perspective. Each punch he threw, each bout he fought, was filled with the determination to honor his father's strength. He dedicated his victories to Bruno, who watched from the sidelines with pride shining in his eyes. One day, After a particularly challenging match, Theodore returned home with a championship belt slung over his shoulder. Bruno, sitting in his favorite armchair, looked up and smiled. Theodore walked over and handed the belt to his father. "This is for you, Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything you've been through, for everything you've done for me." Bruno took the belt, his hands trembling slightly as he held it. Tears welled in his eyes, and he pulled Theodore into a hug. "You make me so proud, my boy," he whispered. Theodore smiled, holding his father close. They had been through darkness, but they had emerged stronger, bound by love and resilience. And as they stood there, embracing in their small living room, they knew that they had already won the greatest fight of all, the fight to stay together, no matter what life threw at them. From that day forward, Bruno and Theodore lived each day with gratitude, cherishing the love that had saved them both. The past was a scar, but it was also a reminder of their strength, and it pushed them to make each day better than the last. Together, they moved forward, living not just in peace, but with purpose, knowing that their bond was unbreakable.